Hi, and welcome back to BeginnerJS. I'm Abrar, and in this video, we're going to learn about functions. Now, functions are widely used in JavaScript programming, and they're very useful because they allow you to reuse code. So let's see what that means. Okay, so functions. What are functions, and why do we need them in JavaScript? Well, functions have a very simple purpose, and that is to allow you to store related code together and allow you to reuse them whenever needed. Now, in JavaScript programming and in any type of programming in general, you'll often write code that you'll want to reuse over and over again. For example, you might have some functionality that you need to reuse over and over again for that specific project, which means you'll be writing the same code or very similar code over and over again, effectively copy pasting it or writing it again from scratch every time you want to use that functionality. However, that is not very useful, that is not efficient, and that is because you're rewriting the same functionality over and over again. That is bad coding practice. Functions solve that problem by allowing you to store the related code together and allow you to reuse them as many times as you want over and over again. So in your code, if you find that you have some functionality that you'll be using multiple times in your code, then it's better to just write a function, add all that code together inside that function, and whenever you need to use that functionality, you can just call that function or execute it, and all the code inside the function will automatically run. And thus, in places where you previously had to rewrite the whole code over again, you can just call the function with just a few lines or maybe one line of code, and that's enough. And that is very efficient as well, because if you have all the functionality and code inside the function, if you want to change something, you can just change the code in the function, and all the function calls in your code will automatically use the new code. You won't have to rewrite the code every time you call that function. You only need to change the code inside the function when you defined it or declared it. So let's see how this works in an example. Okay, so we'll start off by declaring or creating a function. Now in JavaScript, creating a function is called a declaring a function, and you can do that using the function keyword. So the word function is again a special reserved keyword in JavaScript. And just like var, if, and a lot of other special keywords, whenever you type in the keyword function with all letters in lowercase, then JavaScript automatically understands that you're trying to declare a function. So in order to declare a function, you first start by typing in the function keyword, by typing in function. And then, after a space, you type in the function name. Now, just like variables, functions need a unique name as well. And that name must be a unique identifier, meaning that name must be unique inside your code. Now, in this case, you can actually think of variables and functions as being very similar. Variables, in one hand, allow you to store a value and reuse it over and over again. For example, if you're using some value, such as a number or a string or the result of some calculation, and you'll be reusing that value over and over again in your code, you can just declare a variable, say var some value equals that value. And then after that, whenever you need to refer to that value, you can just refer to that value by the variable name, instead of just writing the value by itself. And that is more efficient. Similarly, functions are like variables, but instead of storing values together, they store code together. So functions are like variables, but for storing code instead of values. So just like variables can be used as containers for storing values for reuse, functions can be used as containers for storing a block of code together for reuse. And as with variables, you need a name in order to refer to that specific variable. And similarly with functions, you need a name to refer to that function as well. This is a name that you'll be using to call or execute that function later on in your code. In this case, we'll call our function sayHi, because this function will contain some code that will be used to greet or say hi to the user. So in this case, we'll call the function sayHi. Now after putting in the function name or the unique identifier, you put in an empty pair of parentheses. Now these pairs of parentheses can be used to define parameters, which we'll learn later on. However, if you don't have any parameters, like in this function, you can just put in an empty pair of parentheses and that'll be enough. And after the pair of parentheses is where you define the code that you want to store, and you define that code inside a code block. And again, a code block starts and ends with curly braces, so the whole code should be wrapped up or enclosed in a pair of curly braces. So in this case, at the very end here, we have the starting curly brace. Then we'll define and write all our code inside the function's body, and then at the end we'll have our ending curly brace, which will define the whole function code block. So just to recap, first we have the function keyword, then we have a function's name or the unique identifier that we'll be using to call that function, then an empty pair of parentheses, or inside the parentheses you can define the parameters as well, and then we have the function's code block, which we start with the starting curly brace. Okay, so inside the function's body and inside the function's code block is where we define all the code that we want to store together. Now you can write almost any type of code here. Just like with variables, you can add almost any type of value. Similarly for functions, you can have almost any type of code inside the function's body. However, in this case, we will just write console.log, the string hi there. Now if you don't know what console.log means, it is a very common method used for debugging and testing JavaScript inside the browser. Now when we execute JavaScript inside the browser automatically makes a lot of browser APIs available to your code. And for most browsers, that includes the console object, which allows you to interact with the console. And this console object has a method called the log method, which can be used to log a value to the console. And these values will be logged in the JavaScript console, in the browser's developer tools, or something similar. So in this case, console.log can be used to log a specific value to the console. So in this case, we'll just log the string hi there and then an exclamation symbol. So this is the code that we want to have inside our function. And then at the very end, we have our ending curly brace, and that completes the code block and also our function. So with these 3 lines of code, we have created a function called the sayHi function, which logs to the console the string hi there. Okay, so what do we do now then? Well, if you actually execute this code as it is right now, nothing will happen. No values will actually be logged to the console. And that is because the code defined inside the function is not automatically executed, unlike other JavaScript code. So in this case, if you put the console.log statement outside the function, then in normal execution flow, that console.log statement would have been executed and the value hi there would have been logged to the console. However, all the code inside the typical function like this is not automatically executed. In order to execute the code inside the function, you have to actually call it. Now, how do you call that? You can call that by just typing in the name, very similar to variables. So you do that by typing in sayHi and then a pair of parentheses. Like this. So in this case here, we are calling or executing the sayHi function. And we do that by typing in the function's name, sayHi, and then a pair of parentheses to actually execute the function. This pair of parentheses is actually what tells JavaScript to execute the function and run all the code defined inside the function. So whenever we call the function like this, then we can see that the string hi there is actually logged to the console. So in order to actually run the code inside the function, you need to call the function first. However, that's not all. Remember that all the code inside the function are reusable. So in this case, after we define the sayHi function, we can actually call this function as many times as we want, and all the code inside that function will run over and over again. So in this case, if you call the sayHi function again by typing in sayHi and then a pair of parentheses to execute the function, and then a semicolon to end the statement, you'll see that the string hi there is logged to the console again. So that means the code inside the function has been executed again. And that is the power of functions. And by putting that functionality and related code inside a function, you can reuse that code over and over again and execute it whenever you want just by calling the function's name. And that is how functions work. Okay, so now that we've seen how simple functions work, let's start working with a bit more complex functions. We'll start working with functions with parameters. Now, in the previous example, we didn't have any parameters. However, as I said, functions can have parameters, and they can be used to create a lot of amazing functionality in JavaScript. So let's see how that works. In order to do this, let's create a function. So we'll start by declaring the function by typing in the function keyword. So we type in function, and then we have the function name. So after a space, we define the function's name. In this case, we want the function's name to be findAverage, because that's exactly what this function will do. This function will take 2 numbers and will tell us the average of these 2 numbers. So imagine you're creating an application, a JavaScript application, where you're using a lot of mathematical values. So that application and your code might be relying heavily on different mathematical calculations, and finding the average is one of the most basic calculations that you can do. And in your code, you might find out that you have to find the average of 2 different numbers multiple times. So in this case, you have to use parameters. You can define a function that will calculate the average of 2 numbers for you. And you can do this with parameters. These parameters will allow you to define some values dynamically inside the function. So in this case, because we have to find the average of 2 numbers multiple times in our code, and we don't want to write the same code over and over again, in that case, let's just define a function that will calculate the average for us. And in this function, we'll be using 2 parameters named x and y. So first we define the function by typing in function and then a function name, findAverage, and then we have our pair of parentheses. Now, if you don't have any parameters, you just put in an empty pair of parentheses. However, here we'll define two parameters, and these two parameters will represent the two numbers that we want to find the average of. So in order to define these parameters, we have to first name them, and we can separate them by a comma. So we'll name them x and y. So the first parameter will be named x, and the second parameter will be named y, and we separate them using a comma inside the pair of parentheses. So we type in find average, and then a pair of parentheses, and inside the pair of parentheses we define all our parameters, which in this case is x comma y, because we have two parameters x and y. However, you can have as many as you want depending on your application. And then we'll define all the code inside the function's body inside a code block. So we start off with our starting curly brace. And now inside the function, we will need to calculate the average and return the values. Now inside the function, again remember that we're representing the two numbers that we want to find the average of using the parameters x and y. So x means the first number and y means the second number. And we want to find the average of these two numbers inside our application. So in this case, if we want to do that, we first have to add these two numbers together and then divide by 2, because that is how you find the average. You add all the numbers together and divide by the number of numbers. So in this case, we have two numbers, x and y, so we need to add x and y together and divide by 2. And now, after we're done calculating the average, we want to return that value from the function. Now the return keyword is again a specially reserved keyword in JavaScript, and this return keyword allows us to return a value and exit from the function. So inside a function, whenever we type in the keyword return, the function will actually stop executing and you'll be exited from the function. And as you do that, you can optionally return a value. So in this case, we'll return the average that we have calculated from inside the function. And now, again, the first number is x, the second number is y. So in order to calculate the average, we first add the numbers together. So x plus y inside a pair of parentheses, because we want that to be evaluated first, and then divided by 2, because we want to divide the sum of x and y by 2 to find the average. And then you have a semicolon to end the statement. And finally, we have the ending curly brace to finish off our code block. So that is our function for finding the average value of two numbers. We define a function called findAverage. We define two parameters, x and y, to represent the first value or the first number and the second value or the second number respectively. And inside the function, we use the return keyword to return a value, which is the average of these two numbers. We added x and y together and divided by 2. And that is how we define the findAverage function. So how do you actually use it? How do you actually define two numbers and actually find the average using this function? Let's find out. So again, in order to actually use the function and in order to actually execute the code inside the function, we have to call it or execute that function first. And we do that by typing in the function's name and then a pair of parentheses. So we type in findAverage and then a pair of parentheses to actually execute the function. However, in this case, when we define the pair of parentheses, we have to pass the arguments as parameters. In this case, these arguments are actually the numbers that we want to find the average of. So in this case, we pass the values 2, 8. So the first argument is 2, the second argument is 8. And these two values are actually represented inside the function by the parameter names x and y. So in this case, 2 becomes x and 8 becomes y. So when you call the findAverage function with two arguments, the number 2 and the number 8, then these two values are represented by the parameter names x and y inside the function's definition. And inside the function's definition, as you can see, we're returning the value. And that value is summing up x and y together and dividing it by 2. So in this case, when you call the function findAverage with 2 and 8 as arguments, then inside the function, where these two values are represented by x and y, these two values should be added together and divided by 2. So 2 and 8 should be added together and divided by 2, thus finding the average of these two numbers. And as we all know, 2 and 8 added together, meaning 2 plus 8 equals 10, and 10 divided by 2 equals 5. So that is the average of these two numbers. The average of 2 and 8 is 5, and that is exactly what this function returns, as you can see on the right hand side in the comment. It outputs the value, the number 5. So this function works, and this function can be used to find the average of any two numbers wherever you want in your code. You don't have to rewrite the code over and over again. So let's try this out with a different pair of numbers. So in this case, we'll try finding the average of two different numbers. And again, because we defined the function, we can just call the function again as many times as we want to execute the code and find the average of two values. So we call the function again by typing in findAverage, and then this time we pass in two different numbers as arguments. We pass in 32.2 and 65, and we want to find the average of these two numbers. So when we call the function with these two values this time, again, 32.2 is represented by the parameter named x, and 65 is represented by the parameter named y. And inside the function, we add these two values together and divide it by 2. So similarly, in the second function call, 32.2 and 65 should be added together and divided by 2. And that is the value that should be returned with our code. So now, as we know, 32.2 plus 65 equals 97.2. And 97.2 divided by 2 equals 48.6. And that is the exact value that is returned when this function is called. As you can see on the right hand side, the value returned is 48.6, which is the average of these two numbers. So this function works. It actually works. It can be used to find the average of any two numbers that you want as many times as you want anywhere in your code. You don't have to rewrite the same code or the same functionality over and over again. You can just define that inside the function, and that function can be called with any two argument values to find the average of those two numbers. And that is how parameters work in JavaScript. Now, one thing here. You might notice that the functions that we're declaring and using here look awfully similar to the methods available to strings, numbers, and other JavaScript objects. And that is actually correct. Functions and methods are actually related. When you create a function like we're doing here, we usually call it a function. So findAverage in this case is actually called a function inside JavaScript. However, in JavaScript, we have objects as well, which we'll learn more about in a later video. And these objects can have functions defined as their properties. And when an object property contains a function as a value, that property is called a method, and thus that function becomes a method of that object. And these are the methods that are available to different JavaScript objects such as strings, numbers, booleans, arrays, and so on. So when a function is defined as the value of a property inside an object, you usually call that a method of that object. Otherwise, you just call it a function. Now let's take a look at another practical example of where you might be using functions. Now, let's say that you're creating a JavaScript application where in your application you're having to do a lot of geometric calculations. One of them might be calculating the area of a circle. Now, as we all know, every circle has an area. So whenever we create a circle, that circle has a specific area. And we can calculate that area using a method or a formula. And that is pi r squared, where pi is the mathematical constant, 3.1416 approximately, and r is the radius of the circle. So using the pi r squared formula, if you know the radius of a circle, you can calculate the area of a circle as well. So maybe you're developing a JavaScript application that uses this formula extensively, where you're having to do a lot of calculations relating to calculating the area of a circle. Now again, as any good programmer, you would want to define a function to actually do all this calculation for you, so that you can define that function once, and they can even call that function again and again to calculate the area of different circles. Very similar to the example we just saw, but a bit different. So let's see how we'll do that. So again, we'll start off with declaring a function. So first we type in the function keyword to start the function declaration, and then we type in the function's name. In this case, the function name will be circle area because we're calculating the area of a circle. So we type in function circle area, and then a pair of parentheses. Now inside the pair of parentheses, we will define one parameter, and that is because in order to calculate the area of a circle, we need one value, and that is the radius of a circle. And that value might be different for different calculations. So when we're calculating the area of a circle, we would want to pass that value, the radius of the circle, as an argument when we call the function. And thus, that value should be available as a parameter named r inside our function. So we define just one parameter named r for that calculation. So circle area, parentheses, and inside the parentheses, we have a parameter named r. And then we start our code block with a curly brace. Now inside the function's body or inside the function's code block is where we have to calculate the area and then return the value. So again, we type in the return keyword to return a value, and in this case, the return value will actually be the area of the circle. So what's the formula again? We have the radius of the circle represented by the parameter named r, but the formula is pi r squared. So we need to calculate the square of r, or raise r to the second power, and then we need to multiply that by the mathematical constant pi. Now here you could hard code the value of pi by typing in 3.1416. However, JavaScript actually provides a math object which has a property named pi. So you could just type in math.pi to automatically get the value of the pi constant. So we just type in that. So math.pi multiplied by r squared. Now in this case, JavaScript actually gives us an exponential operator which can be used to raise a certain value to a certain power. And that exponential operator is basically two multiplication operators side by side. So two asterisks. So r and then two asterisks or exponential operator, and 2 means r squared or r raised to the second power. So r exponentiation 2 or r squared, and we calculate that inside the parentheses, and then we multiply that value by the mathematical constant pi. So the formula is pi r squared, pi multiplied by r squared, and that is the value that we calculate here inside our function. we have math.pi, then a multiplication operator, and then inside the parentheses, we have r, the exponential operator, and 2, so pi r squared. And in doing so, assuming r is the radius of the circle, we have successfully calculated the area of the circle, and then we return that value from the function. And finally, we put in our ending curly brace to finish off the code block and our function. And that is how we define the circle area function. But does it actually work? Let's find that out. So in order to test whether this function actually works or not, let's call this function with the value as the radius of the circle, and let's figure out whether the function was able to calculate the area of the circle correctly or not. So in this case, let's say that we have a circle with a radius 5. It might be 5 meters, 5 centimeters, 5 inches, or anything else. So we have a circle with a radius 5, and we want to calculate the area of that specific circle. How do we do that? So in this case, we can just call the function. So we can type in circle area, and then parentheses to actually execute the function, and inside the parentheses was where we define or pass the arguments. In this case, we pass the number 5 as an argument, and this number is represented by the parameter named r inside our function. And inside our function, we calculate pi r squared and return the value. So in this case, the function should calculate pi into 5 squared and then return the value, because that is the area of the circle. So in this case, when we call circle area and then 5 inside parentheses, we get the value 78.54 approximately. And that is the value that is returned by this function. And if you manually calculate pi into 5 squared, you'll see that this is actually the correct value. So this function was able to calculate the area of the circle correctly by using the radius as a parameter. So this function actually works. Let's try that again with a different value in order to evaluate whether this works or not. So we'll type in circle area, and then inside the parentheses, we pass two values in this case, 4.2 and 65. So we actually pass two values as arguments. However, inside the function definition, we have only defined one parameter. So what exactly happens in this case? Well, the function actually works as expected. The second argument, 65, is ignored and discarded completely. You can actually straight retrieve it inside the function. However, the only named parameter is the radius r, which is represented by 4.2. So as you can see here, if you call a function with more values as arguments than you have defined inside the function as parameters, then those extra arguments are ignored, and the parameter values that you have specified and named inside the function, those are only used. So in this case, the first argument, or 4.2, is represented by the parameter named r, and inside the function we calculate pi r squared and return the value. And the argument 65 is discarded. It is still available inside the arguments object, however it's not used in our calculation. So with our calculation, we are assuming that the radius is 4.2, and if we're calculating the area of the radius 4.2, the result is approximately 55.42. And if you manually calculate the area of a circle with the radius 4.2, as you can see, this is the correct value. So this function actually works. And with this function, we can calculate the area of any circle given the radius whenever we want, however we want, and how many times we want it. And that is just one example of how functions can be used. Now, before this video ends, let's take a quick look at variable scope. Now, variable scope is a concept in JavaScript which limits the scope of variables, which means a variable declared inside a scope is only available in that scope and not in any other scope or outside that scope. Let's take an example to clear that out. In this case, we'll create a function. We can name it anything we want, so we just name it some function. So declare the function with the function keyword, and then some function. We won't be declaring any parameters, so we just type in an empty pair of parentheses, and then a curly braces to start the function code block. Now inside the function, we declare a variable, because again, inside the function we can write almost any type of code. So we just declare a variable in this case. So we type in var x equals 2, meaning we're declaring a variable called x with the value 2. Very good. And then we type in the return keyword. And remember, when you type in the return keyword, the function execution is stopped, and in this case we're returning the value, the variable x. So just return the value of the variable x, meaning we're returning the number 2 essentially. And then after that, we end the curly brace, and thus ending the code block in our function definition. So this is a function inside which we've declared a variable x which equals to 2, and then we return the value of x inside the function. Now in this case, we declared that variable x inside the function. However, what if we try to access that variable outside the function? Now as you can see here, if we try to refer to the variable x outside the function, we can't do that. We get a reference error instead. So in this case, whenever we type in x, we get a reference error, and that is because x is not defined or available outside the function. You see, in JavaScript, variables are what is called function scoped, which means they're scoped to whatever function they're declared in. And if a variable is declared inside that function, then that variable is only available inside the function. and not outside it. In this case, we're defining a function called sum function, and inside this function, we define a variable, and we declare the variable x with a value 2. And inside this function, we have access to the variable x. We can modify it, we can change it, we can do anything we want. We can do any type of calculation with it, just like we normally would. However, because this variable is declared inside this function, it is not available outside the function. This variable x is said to be scoped inside this function that is declared in, and thus this variable is not available outside the function. However, if you declare the variable outside the function, then that variable would have been global, and thus you could use it outside the function and inside the function as well. But whenever you use the var keyword to declare a variable inside the function, then that variable is scoped to that function, and that variable can be accessed or otherwise modified from outside the function. Now that might not seem like much, but this is actually very important and very powerful. And this unique characteristic of variables called the variable scope is the basis for a lot more advanced and a lot more complicated JavaScript concepts such as closures and encapsulation, which we'll get to learn in more advanced level JavaScript.